So my title actually is a bit too complicated. I should probably have just should mention what can we learn from monogenic diseases of the immune system. So it's a meeting of genomics, so you will hear from me the simplest part of genomics, that is to consider disease essentially caused by mutation in a single gene, although it's probably not fully correct. It is in most of the cases correct. So what I will try to do is to illustrate from recent findings in our lab of what we can learn from the studies of these diseases, and perhaps sometimes this may be relevant. I hope you will be convinced of that with a few examples. It could be relevant to understanding and even more therapy of more complex diseases of the immune system. So today, we know something like 370 monogenic diseases affecting the immune system, thanks to Capucine Picard, who is working in Paris, who is following up every year with this graph, which is not that easy to build because of the many publications. So of course, there are different modes of inheritance. And altogether, we estimate today that the incidence is something in 2,000 live births. So most of them have Mendelian inheritance. There are some exceptions, of course. And obviously, these genetic disorders, they cause vulnerability to pathogens, lots of, sometimes restricted to one single pathogen, and sometimes very broad, like in severe combined immunodeficiencies. As I will discuss, they predispose to autoimmune diseases. They may predispose to allergy, inflammation, and cancer. I will discuss one example of cancer. Obviously, they affect all arms of the immune system, so gene products involved in cell differentiation, effector functions, regulation, innate immunity, adaptive immunity, although this is not equally distributed, but I'm not going to talk about that today. And finally, of course, their studies over time have helped to identify key molecules involved in at least human immune responses, help to identify pathways and functions. So I will take 4 vignettes to try to illustrate some of these aspects. The first one is related to T cells and T cell activation. So you have a relatively simplified picture here of the molecules and the pathways involved downstream of the T cell receptor upon antigen activation. And every single molecule in brown or pink, I don't know exactly, is a molecule that has been found defective in a given primary immunodeficiency in humans, so many of them, as you can see, from the NF-kappa B signaling pathway, the molecules associated with T-cell receptor, and so on and so on. But what I will try to discuss today is this molecule named CTPS1. I will tell you in a second what it is, and also the one above, RAS-GRP1. So CTPS1 stands for cytidine triphosphate synthase. It's an enzyme of the pyrimidine synthesis pathway, so the so-called de novo pyrimidine synthesis pathway, as you can read, together with another enzyme encoded by another gene. They are able to transform UTP into CTP, and of course CTP is a key molecule in nucleic acid synthesis, since it gives rise, of course it's necessary for RNA synthesis, but also through transformation into deoxy-CTP, which is the restricting nucleotide for DNA synthesis. So it's a key pathway, of course, for cell growth, obviously. So a few years ago, some patients actually living in northern England who were diagnosed by Peter Arkwright to have an immunodeficiency were found to have a genetic defect in CTPS1, CTPS synthetase 1. So these patients have a very severe immunodeficiency in terms of vulnerability to several viral infections that may lead to death early on in the first years of life. Surprisingly, despite the fact that they have a major defect in the de novo pyrimidine synthesis pathway, they don't have any developmental defect. There is nothing wrong in these patients but lymphocytes, as I will discuss. This is a disease with autosomal recessive inheritance. There are variable immune defects. I will not go into the detail. I will insist on the last aspect, which is expected from the deficiency. That is an impaired capacity of T and B cells to proliferate. So all of the patients now, there are something like 15 who have been reported. They all have the same mutation, which is a mutation in the splicing site located here at an intron, I don't forget which number of intron it is, but the consequence, this is what is important, is that the protein is virtually absent. On this blot, you can't see any protein. Actually, if one looks very, very carefully, there is a little bit, so actually it's an hypomorphic mutation with a little bit of normal protein made, but this is only a few %. So it's a loss of expression, partial one, but profound. So associated with what is shown here, that is an impaired capacity of T cells, as well as B cells, to expand in vitro at least, and clearly in vivo too, in the context of activation through the T cell receptor CD3 complex. This is shown here with data index of proliferation compared to control when stimulated with an anti-CD3 or CD23 and 28. This is the image of dilution of the tracer comparing a patient to a control, and that the gene defect is causal is demonstrated by the complementation by introducing a normal copy and restores T cell proliferation. And in terms of metabolism, as expected, the product of the enzyme activity, that is CTP, is reduced in concentration in cells. Interestingly enough, in resting T cells, there is a defect as compared to controls, but it's not that huge, much more and probably relevant to the pathophysiology. And the point I'd like to make is that in activated T cells, there is very little CTP available. It's the same in EBV B cell lines, by the way, compared to controls. So actually, the understanding, it's of course a summary of data here. The understanding here is that this CTPS1 molecule and its messenger RNA is transcribed upon activation through the T cell receptor or the B cell receptor. Here you have the kinetics of the detection of the messenger RNA into T cells. Here you see that there is a peak shortly after activation, 45 to 1 hour, 30 minutes. So it's an enzyme that is present at the low level at the resting state, that is heavily upregulated through transcriptional regulation early on following T cell and actually B cell activation, which is not shown here. And this is the CTP concentration upon activation of CTPS1 positive or normal T cells, so there is a peak of production of CTP early on after T cell activation, which of course makes sense in the context of induction of intense T cell proliferation. So actually we do know a little bit more, and we'll see a few more data about it. That is so what is the control of transcription of CTPS1? The data here are not completely settled, but in the promoter there are binding sites for these transcription factors, and probably STAT5 also is able to bind. And by using inhibitors, we know that this pathway, through the RAS pathway, is involved, and I will show you further evidence, in inducing CTPS1 expression. And by the way, CTPS1 makes tetramers, is regulated by phosphorylation, and intriguingly, I'm not sure about the word, it looks a bit surprising, but CTPS1 makes filaments into cells, and perhaps it's active as filament, but it's another simplification of what do we know. But based on these findings, and this is perhaps where relevance for more common diseases may come, we thought that since patients who do not have or have very little CTPS1 have a profound immunodeficiency but have no developmental defects, perhaps this molecule is a potential good target for immunosuppression. That is, if one can find out molecules that are able to inhibit in a reversible manner the CTPS1 activity, you may block expansion of both T and B cells when you want to block them, like in autoimmune diseases. And actually, a company, small biotech, has been created with the aim of developing such anti-CTPS1, so CTPS1 inhibitory molecules to be used for immunosuppression. We'll see in the future whether this is going to work or not. So still on the same pathway leading, as you will see, on CTPS1 induction, there is the RAS pathway with RAS-GRP1. So RAS-GRP1 is a guanidine exchange factor used that is expressed in T and B and NK cells that is activating RAS and downstream the ERK, so the MAP kinase pathway, and, which, as you know, is very important in T lymphocyte activation. So we found, again, patients who have deficiency in RAS-GRP1. Here, there is another report, by the way, two other reports one from Bostug in Austria. And this family here, where two patients are affected. And both of them develop very severe infections with Epstein-Barr virus, again, severe predisposition to viruses. And here you have the EBV load in the blood of one of the patients. Each time it drops, this is because the patient was treated with antibodies to destroy B cells, but it came again and again. And one patient died with Hodgkin lymphoma, actually. So both of these children, by exon sequencing and confirmation, were found to have recessive homozygous mutations with the insertion of two nucleotides here at the C-terminal part of the encoded molecule. And it led to detection of the messenger RNA, not shown here, but importantly, the protein is not found in patient cells. And here again, as you will see in a second, there is a deficiency in the capacity of T cells to expand. But before that, here is the demonstration that it leads to a defect in the MAP kinase pathway with the defective phosphorylation of ERK. Despite the presence of the protein, the phosphorylation is much reduced. Okay, and the phenotype is quite similar to the one of CTPS1 deficiency in terms of capacity of T cells to proliferate. You have on the top part of the slide, you see in blue, pale blue, the control proliferation of T cells activated by an anti-CD3 antibody with dilution of the tracer violet, which is not the case with patient cells. Again, it can be complemented by introduction cells in red here of a normal copy of RAS-GRP1. So the defect is really caused by deficiency in RAS-GRP1. And in vivo consequences, for instance, since EBV is a relevant virus for these patients, is the detection of EBV-specific CD8 T cells by using pentamers with the right HLA molecule. So in controls, it can be detected, whereas in patients, despite the very severe and chronic EBV infection, no such cells, or very little, actually, this is not non-specific binding, were not detected. So the consequence of defective proliferation, or perhaps defective activation, is the lack of EBV-specific cells, and hence the lack of control of EBV. So to connect with CTPS1 I just discussed, so this is the picture shows the activation, induction of CTPS1 upon T cell activation. With control cells, you see there is an accumulation of CTPS1. This is the protein from 6 hours to 3 days following activation, whereas with patient cells, there is a little bit of activation, but it's much reduced. And actually, if you downregulate expression of RAS-GRP1 in control cells, then the CTPS1 activity is reduced. This is the red curve compared to the black one. So there is a connection between RAS-GRP1 and CTPS1. It's not all of the explanation of how CTPS1 expression is controlled, but clearly the pathway leading to CTPS1 gene induction, transcription induction, is under the control of this pathway that includes RAS-GRP1. And obviously, this pathway is critical for T cell activation, and specifically, I have no time to go into details, specifically in T cell receptor-driven T cell expansion. So the question, which is still today a question, is whether this key critical pathway may be amenable to pharmacological modulation in the context of attempt at immunosuppression. So, okay, so that was my first vignette, as I said. The second one is related to the Ikaros, or IKZF1 gene product. As you know, it's a very important transcription factor that is expressed in the hematopoietic system. It is present with many different isoforms. It's pretty complicated for someone like me who is new in the field. I can tell you it's a bit complicated, but anyway, I will try to tell you what I know. It acts as a homo or an heterodimer with IKZF2 and 3, Helios and Aiolos. It has multiple target genes. It is known to be involved in lymphocyte differentiation to control peripheral lymphocyte homeostasis, and the molecule is also involved in development of myeloid cells. So this is the structure of the protein with 6 zinc finger domains. Zinc finger 1 to 4 are constitutive of the DNA binding domain of Ikaros, whereas the last 2, the number 5 and 6, are the dimerization domain that makes these homodimers or heterodimers. And finally, but very importantly, of course, somatic mutations, loss of functions by deletions have been associated with B-cell acute lymphoblastic leukemia. A little bit more about Ikaros. It is known that Ikaros localizes on pericentromeric heterochromatin, as shown here. So Ikaros is involved in lymphoid development and perhaps is associated with repressed genes, and of course is under tight regulation. So about 1 year ago, there has been a report from scientists from the NIH with Stefan Rosenzweig and others describing heterozygous loss of function mutations of Ikaros with different mutations, either point mutations in zinc finger number 2 or 3, or deletion, as you can see here, in another case, of part of the molecule. And this disease is consisting in a B-cell immunodeficiency. These patients have very few B lymphocytes. They are hypogammaglobulinemic. And they have shown that these mutants are loss of function and the proteins are unable to bind target DNA sequences. So these are haploinsufficient deficiency and cause of this B-cell immunodeficiency. But slightly later, and by we, I mean Damien Boudboul and Sylvain Latour and others, found in several families, together with colleagues in Japan, de novo heterozygous mutations in the very same gene, and you have the pedigrees, families A to G on the top. And in that case, as you will see, the mutation is still an heterozygous mutation, so dominant mutation, but it's no longer haploinsufficient, but transdominant, it's dominant negative, as you will see. And the mutations here, they lies on residue 159, where asparagine is replaced either by a serine or a threonine, and this is right in the zinc finger number 2. So you will see how it looks in 3D modeling later on, involved in DNA binding. This region is highly conserved between species, but also highly conserved between the different members of the family, IKZF1, 2, and 3. This is here. You see asparagine is everywhere. Whatever you look at IKZF1, 2, 3 in humans, mice, or other species. Okay, so a little bit more about this case. So this is not demonstrations of the dominant negative effect, but just the demonstration in electrophoresis mobility shift assay that there is little binding on targets. These are 2 different targets located normally in centromeres of IKZF1. There is very little binding, and this is the quantification. The demonstration of the dominant negative effect comes from these experiments, where following a transient transfection of wild type as well as mutated IKZF1 in NIH3T3 cells and staining of Ikaros with the right antibody, you can see here that comparing this mutation, which is the one leading to haploinsufficiency, to that one, so the asparagine into threonine mutation on position 159, that this one is inducing a transdominant effect. Since this is the wild type, you see the spots of IKZF1 in the nucleus, the happy staining. You see with that mutation, you see nothing. And if you add wild type sequence of Ikaros on top of the mutated one, you can detect these spots, indicating that this molecule apparently does not induce any inhibition, whereas, and this is the key experiment here, when you add wild type Ikaros to cells in which this mutant is expressed, you don't see, you can't detect the spots, despite the fact that the protein is in the nucleus, but they can't form the normal spots at right positions. This is the quantification here. So clearly, this particular mutation is haploinsufficient, whereas these 2 are dominant negative. And what is striking is that, and why I'm insisting on that, it is that the consequences are much more severe of these dominant negative mutations, since the patients from the different families I mentioned who are carrying this mutation at position 159, they not only have a B-cell immunodeficiency, but they have a T-cell immunodeficiency with defective T-cell receptor-induced proliferation that is not corrected by IL-2, by the way, shown here. They have in their blood, they have essentially naive T-cells, very few memory T-cells. And in vitro, if you try to induce the switch towards a memory phenotype, it doesn't work well. So this is what is shown in blue. So most of the cells are naive, and they stay with this phenotype over time, and the other ones are dying, compared to, in red, to the control cells that are losing their naive phenotype and acquiring the memory phenotype. So there is obviously a defect in the switch from a naive to a memory phenotype. In addition, there are some myeloid defects. For instance, there are very few myeloid DCs shown here and here. And by the way, the T-cell proliferation defect can be corrected by addition of wild-type monocytes or B cells on dendritic cells. So it seems that the dendritic cell deficiency in dendritic cell differentiation is quite critical in that disease. So in summary of what I showed you up to now about Ikaros, there are mutations in several places of zinc finger domain 2 or 3 that are leading to this B-cell immunodeficiency, so associated with haploinsufficiency. And these mutations, almost at the same position, but they are different, obviously, that are leading now, that are inducing a dominant negative effect associated with a T plus B-cell immunodeficiency. But on top of that, to show you that monogenic diseases may not be as simple as thought sometimes, we have a third phenotype we observed recently about the very same Ikaros molecule, which is a gain of function that has been observed in 3 patients. There is incomplete penetrance in the family, but as you can read in the red rectangle, these patients have developed severe autoimmunity, Evans syndrome, so the combination of ITP, thrombocytopenia, and autoimmune hemolytic anemia. One has type 1 diabetes, autoimmune hepatitis, Rosai-Dorfman disease, that is expansion of with a very special pathology of lymph nodes, celiac disease, diffuse nodal lymphoplasia, and lots of autoantibodies. So it's a completely different phenotype that is autoimmune. So here, these patients, the 3 patients, they have the very same missense mutation, still an heterozygous mutation, located on the part of the molecule which is the zinc finger 3 domain, so still in the DNA binding domain of Ikaros, so where arginine is substituted by histidine. So there are many, many immunological defects in these cases. I have no time to go into too many details, but it's a little bit the converse image from the previous cases, where there is, in this case, hyperactivation of T cells, hyperproliferation, but also there is an expansion of myeloid cells, such as eosinophilia, for instance. This is the illustration of excessive proliferation. And importantly, in EMSA assay, it is shown here with the mutant protein of Ikaros. There is an increased binding to, here there is one example, but there are more, of Ikaros binding site into the genome. And here in a luciferase assay of suppression of a given gene by Ikaros, this is the mutant here. It's as low, so the inhibition is at least as low, as important, as it is with the wild-type sequence. And here's an attempt at modelization of these mutations. So the N159 is the mutation associated with the transdominant negative effect. It's located where there is this position has hydrophilic bonds with DNA, with adenine, apparently, from what I have been told. I'm not an expert, I have to say. So this is partially disrupted when there is a mutation. And R1I3 is also interacting with DNA, but it possibly that the mutation, that's not clear today, may enhance interaction with, or stabilize interaction of Ikaros with DNA. So we have 3 phenotypes from the very same gene with the same inheritance, dominant inheritance, when the mutation is haploinsufficient, it causes a B-cell immunodeficiency, a quote, common variable immunodeficiency, with, in a few cases, T-cell ALL. With dominant negative mutations, the phenotype is much more severe, including also a T-cell immunodeficiency. And conversely, gain of function mutation, as recently observed, leads to lymphoproliferation and to immunity. But in that case, there is no risk of leukemia. So I think this is illustrating how complex, or at least diverse, may be consequences of mutations of the very same gene as a function of the mutation. Of course, lots remain to be done to be understand exactly to how these different mutations are causing these different phenotypes. Okay, so this gain of function mutation of Ikaros allows me to, if I may say so, to introduce the third topic, which is autoimmunity related to monogenic diseases. Among the many monogenic disorders of the immune system, there are at least 150 that are causing autoimmunity and or autoinflammation. And this is so a bit less than half of the overall group of so-called primary immunodeficiencies. And in terms of patients, this is 25% of patients with primary immunodeficiencies who exhibit autoimmune features. So it is anticipated that perhaps if we can understand the pathophysiology, we may understand better the mechanism of control of autoimmunity, which may be of broader relevance, of course. Just to give you an idea, not going, of course, into details, that with distinct genotypes, so different monogenic autoimmune diseases, they have different kinds of different forms of autoimmunity. Here on this graph, for instance, this is heterozygous loss of function of CTLA4. This is associated with, very frequently with autoimmune hemolytic anemia, thrombocytopenia, lung disease, enteropathy, whereas, for instance, patients who have mutations in FAS, who have the so-called autoimmune lymphoproliferative syndrome, they also have autoimmune hemolytic anemia, but they don't have an enteropathy, they don't have a lung disease. So every single gene defect is inducing a different spectrum of autoimmune manifestations, which of course would be important to understand how it works. And today we are far from understanding this diversity of phenotypes associated with this diversity of genotypes. What we can say by trying to classify what has been described up to now, that there are at least 6 mechanisms that are disrupted in these patients that are causing autoimmunity or susceptibility to autoimmunity. And of course, they are all essential, all critical, because the failure of one of them is sufficient to cause autoimmunity. So there is no redundancy at all in between these different pathways. I will not detail them, but of course you know all of them. Negative selection, which is rarely affected actually, but there is, of course, the AIR deficiency that is very well known, deficiency in the FOXP3 regulatory T cells, the role of FAS and FAS ligand in elimination of lymphocytes reactive to cells in the periphery. Of course, this is quite simplified, but it's the idea. The checkpoints inhibitor like CTLA4 and LRBA that is regulating CTLA4 expression, a number of rheostats, each Roquine, Eteline, and so on. Clonal redemption of B cells, that's for the specialist is in the room, you will see, perhaps, tomorrow or the next day. And, of course, on top of these 6 mechanisms, there are many mutations causing gain of effector functions, like the one I briefly described related to Icaros. If we go a little bit further, if we compare the frequency, the risk at developing autoimmunity, if you have a known genetic defect of the immune system, compared to a global population of people not supposed to have any genetic defect, one finds a few interesting things. For instance, if you take autoimmune cytopenias and you compare the prevalence of occurrence of autoimmune cytopenias in patients with known PIDs, like CTLA4 mutation, Icaros, and so on, the prevalence is 120 in 1,000, so 12% of patients. If you make the calculation in the general population from the available data, is 1 in 1,000. So the relative risk is 1 to 120. If you take specifically children with autoimmune hemolytic anemias, the relative risk, based on French data, is 830, and so on and so on. So if you this led us to think in the reverse way, that the relative risk is so high. Perhaps it suggests that actually, say, if we take only children, of course, which is more amenable to have a chance to find a monogenic disease or oligogenic mutations. So if we take the reverse way of thinking, that is, if we consider the population of children without known genetic defects, but having an autoimmune hemolytic anemia, what is the chance that they may have a genetic defect as a cause of the autoimmune hemolytic anemia? So we did this and tried to find if there are broader examples of genetic causes of autoimmunity in children, and we have done it with 2 cohorts. I will essentially mention one today, which is the one with Evans syndrome, that is the combination of autoimmune hemolytic anemia and immune thrombocytopenia. 80 patients have been analyzed, mostly by Frédéric Rieulecar. Nathalie Legidi as the clinical registry about these patients. And we have a second cohort. I will only show one slide about pediatric systemic lupus erythematosus. So these patients were systematically analyzed genetic-wise by a dedicated panel and exome sequencing. And it was found for the Evans syndrome that among the 80 patients, mutations that may be causal, they are not all validated today, so we have to be a little bit cautious, but there are strong data supporting the concept that they are causal, have been found in 65% of them. So 2/3 of them have mutations, either they are carrying variants that have previously been described in the context of a primary immunodeficiency. You have the list of genes here. I will not go into the detail. And perhaps more interestingly, other mutants were found in other genes, including at that time Icaros, I mentioned earlier. Now Icaros should be moved to the upper panel, but doesn't matter. So mutations found in JAK1, JAK2, and FAT, and so on, associated with Evans syndrome. And not for all yet, but for many of these variants, there is the functional validation that at least they are causing either loss of function or gain of function. Of course, to fully demonstrate that these mutations are causal or essential in inducing the Evans syndrome is pretty tough, but it suggests it is the case, especially since for some of them, this is shown here in red, there are recurrences. That is, we found 2 patients from different families with heterozygous gain-of-function mutation of JAK1, for instance, or 2 patients with mutation in NFAT or TNF receptor 2 and Icaros I mentioned. So, and in terms of broadly speaking, on what could be the function affected, some of the mutations or variants to be cautious have something to do with regulatory T cells, like variants of AKZF2, Helios, that is expressed in regulatory T cells, for instance. Many gain-of-function mutations in N-effector cells, as well as some mutations associated with apoptosis. Interestingly enough, from these studies, one can today, the first conclusion is that if this is correct, there is a diversity of potential mechanisms accounting for autoimmune hemolytic anemia and thrombocytopenia in children based on germline genetic abnormalities. In most of the cases, there are a few somatic mutations. And interestingly enough, in 36% of them, based on the mutations like gain of function of JAK1, there is a potential dedicated targeted therapy. Obviously, inhibitors of JAK, for instance, would be obvious for these cases. So this may have a medical impact in the near future. Of course, this is going to be carefully analyzed. Also, what is supporting the idea that these mutations play a role is that if one compares the group of patients with variants detected compared to the ones without, those with the mutation tend to be more severe, knowing that in addition there may be more variants here we haven't been able to detect for sure. So they have more associated lymphoproliferation, more autoimmunity, they need more therapies, and the few cases of patients who died, they are all in the group in red with mutations. So this is all supporting that indeed genetics is playing a role there in inducing these autoimmunity, severe autoimmunity in children. Just one single word about lupus. I don't want to be too long. So the cohort that Frédéric Yoleka and others are analyzing is made of 95 patients, so they're all children. So by the same approach, mutations have been found in 40, so 42% of them. Again, sometimes in known pathogenic variants like complement factor genes, this is obvious, and other genes mentioned here. And very interestingly, of course, are those 23 likely pathogenic variants in different genes. And strikingly enough, there are 3 of them that are related to the unfolded protein response. So the connection between lupus and the unfolded protein response is far from obvious, but it's striking to see that there are, if I remember correctly, altogether there are 5 patients who have either variants, which is a loss of function variant in ERN1 or PERK or GAD34. So how it works, we have no idea. Just I'd like to mention the work in Belgium of Sophie Janssens, who has shown that the UPR response, especially ERN1, is constitutively active in a subset of dendritic cells. So there may be a connection, but how, we have no idea. So I will not speak more about it. Okay, and my final illustration I'd like to discuss is related to lymphoma. So if we take these general view of actually what we are trying to do is based on cohorts of children with phenotype related to the immune system, autoimmunity, as I discussed briefly, lymphomas now, or infections, obviously. It could be also allergy. Perhaps the description of phenotype, genotypes, understanding pathophysiology may be useful in several ways. So what about lymphomas? There is one story I like to share with you that has been recently published. This is the work mostly of Nada Jabado in Montreal, Canada, and Geneviève de Saint-Basile at Imagine Institute. This is the finding of germline mutations in most, not all, but most of the patients who have developed a rare case of lymphoma, which is so-called subcutaneous panniculitis-like T-cell lymphoma, SPTCL, that is sometimes associated with HLH, so activation of Th1 cells to try to describe it in simple words. So with HLH, hemophagocytic lymphohistiocytic syndrome. So it's a non-Hodgkin T-cell lymphoma, HLH is present, and there is a group of 27 cases that has been studied. And we had the idea to look for genetic variants because we were struck by the observation that there are some families with more than one case. Here you see these two siblings, and here again, they have been affected at different ages, usually during the pediatric age, but there are also cases in adults. And interestingly enough, the majority of these patients are originating from East Asia and Polynesia. These are the clinical pictures. They are subcutaneous nodules. And if you do a PET scan, you can see the intensity of labeling at places of infiltration. And the infiltration is made of CD8 T cells that are monoclonal and that are located in the subcutaneous adipose tissues, in the fat, and they are actually surrounding, rimming the adipocytes. You can see them here, the CD8 staining around the adipocytes are located. There is a dense infiltrate of this monoclonal T cell population, and this is the staining with granzyme B, indicating that these cells are activated. So they are clonal and they express, with one exception, a T cell receptor of the alpha-beta phenotype. So the genetic studies was undertaken by exome sequencing. Actually, it was found that the 16 patients are carrying recessive mutations, in most of the cases homozygous mutations, and there are two of them, either mutation Y leading to Y82C or I97M in the gene encoding TIM3. So TIM3, I'm sure you know, is a checkpoint inhibitor. I will come back to that. And so these mutations are found in a domain encoding an Ig-like domain, and these are the mutations, and actually these lead to misfolding of the protein. This has been shown by chromatography assay. I will not show to you. Interestingly enough, the mutation where the tyrosine is modified into a cysteine is found in the East Asia, Polynesia, and this allele is relatively frequent in the population of Polynesia. It's 4% of the population in Polynesia only. Okay, so these are germline mutations. They are not somatic mutations. These are germline mutations. So what is TIM3? I remind you, it's a membrane molecule that is expressed by T lymphocytes, NK lymphocytes, dendritic cells, macrophages. It has several ligands, like galectin, SECAM, phosphatidylserine at the surface of apoptotic cells. And it is known to be a negative regulator of T cell activation as well as monocyte and dendritic cell activation by interacting its ligand. So classically here, here you have what could be the case of an interaction of TIM3 with one of its ligands that is down-relating, like PD-1, PD-L1, if you like, antigen-driven T cell activation. So what is the consequence of the mutation? It's a loss of function and a loss of expression. This is TIM3 staining in biopsies of tumors in 2 patients compared on the top of the expression of TIM3 in a STPCL case without mutation of TIM3. So it's the best control we can have. So you can see the expression here on the inset of TIM3 in the periphery of the cell, whereas in the cases of TIM3 mutants, you can detect TIM3 as spots inside cells actually located close to the Golgi, but not at the surface. And this is staining in the periphery of monocytes, activated CD4 and CD8 T cells. There is no expression of TIM3 compared to control. So this has been found in 16 out of 27 cases of patients with this particular form of T-cell lymphoma. So just I remind you, is this French language slide based on a small review that has been done by colleagues, that TIM3 is interacting with dendritic cells, apoptotic cells through phosphatidylserine, and of course tumor cells, since it may be involved in downregulating responses to tumors. And this is the immunoglobulin domain that is mutated in the patients that is mostly involved in the interaction with the different ligands. The functional consequences in the patients is that there are inflammatory markers. For instance, in the serum of these patients, there is a much increased detection of CXCL10, which is the expression of which is under gamma interferon induction. Soluble CD25, the marker of T-cell activation, and here now a marker of innate immunity with IL-1 beta, and in vitro with cells by activating them with LPS, one induces an increased production of TNF, and the NLRP3 inflammasome is also involved because the combination of nigericin and LPS is inducing a much important production of IL-1. So there is both a deregulation of innate immunity in terms of cytokine production and of T cells, at least Th1, probably it's a bit more complicated than that. So altogether, the conclusion from this study, or at least the part I showed you, is that TIM3 germline loss of functional mutations is found in approximately 60% of cases of these subcutaneous paniculatis-like T-cell lymphoma. So perhaps it's not really a lymphoma, but more an inflammatory disease with a loss of control of a T-cell population, but that can be argued. This is important because it suggests that these patients may no longer be treated by chemotherapy, but rather by anti-inflammatory drugs. And we have preliminary evidence that JAK inhibitors, for instance, induce remission very easily, which of course is good news for the patients. So immunomodulation may be a more accurate therapy for these rare patients than chemotherapy. So now there is a striking observation. It looks like TIM3 plays a very unique role in the control of immune functions, both innate and adaptive, in adipose tissues. Of course, the next question is how. So what is the specific role of TIM3 in adipose tissues? What is the right ligand? How it works? Today, I have just no idea. Please don't ask me the question. I don't know, unfortunately. Of course, then this should be looked. Probably in murine models, I hope we'll be able to decipher this intriguing question. But by the way, as you know, TIM3 is a target for cancer immunotherapy. There are many trials, clinical trials ongoing with combinations of checkpoints inhibitor, for instance, blocking both PD-1 and TIM3. So perhaps the observation of these patients should lead to a word of caution about the risk that may be associated by inhibiting for a too prolonged period of time expression of TIM3 in a given individual. I don't know, of course, this is more speculative. All right, I will stop there just with a few conclusions based on this scheme of the way actually we are trying collectively to decipher the consequences of genetic defects of the immune system with potential application in other settings. So at least I think we can say that pediatric immunopathological diseases are more likely to be genetically determined. And I think, at least for autoimmunity, today I would say that a child who is developing autoimmunity should have a genetic analysis because there is quite a chance to find something, and this may be relevant for treatment. From time to time, these findings contribute to understanding the pathophysiology and take medical decision, as just said. And finally, this, with variable consideration, may have some direct or indirect, like for TIM3, impact or insight into more complex diseases of the immune system. Just to finish, I'd like to mention a few of the many people who have been involved in these studies. The group Sylvain Latour and Latour has been involved in the study of the description, of the CTPS1 and RAS-GRP1 deficiency. Geneviève de Saint-Basile and other people here, in collaboration with Nada Jabado at McGill in Montreal, have described these, the SPTCL lymphomas related to TIM3. Frédéric Fioloca, Aude Majerus, Nadia Jeremia, and a few others have been involved in the study of the cohort of patients with autoimmune diseases. And the study on Icaros is performed by Sylvain and others in collaboration with the group of Rosenzweig at the NIH in Washington. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alain, for that masterful tour of primary immunodeficiency 2019. So, who'd like to ask a question?
Thank you very much. Just to clarify, for the Icaros mutation, you said that the dominant negative, so your phenotype number 2, was only de novo, so no carriers?
Yes.
And germline?
Germline, yes.
So
it's probably not surprising because I would not expect someone with such a mutation not being treated by bone marrow transplantation to survive.
So how do you explain that the homozygous phenotype would only affect the B-cell compartment?
It was not homozygous. It was also heterozygous mutation.
Was also heterozygous phenotype.
With a loss of function.
Okay.
And haploinsufficiency.
Then I understand.
Okay?
Thank you.
So perhaps I was not clear enough. Sorry. So all three mutants, all three phenotypes are associated with heterozygous mutations.
Well, thanks a lot. Concerning the last part on team 3, well, you wonder whether it's a lymphoma or it's not a lymphoma. You look in the cells which are abnormal, which looks like the lymphoma, whether they carry other mutations, because I would expect, it would be expected probably that if it's a true lymphoma, they will have probably more than one mutation.
Of course, this is the next obvious question. I don't have data yet. In the literature, there are a few reports of attempts at finding somatic mutations associated with these lymphomas, but the results are negative, which doesn't tell us that they don't exist. Of course, it would be interesting to decipher whether there are some somatic mutations.
Can I ask a cheeky follow-up question? I think you mentioned that those cells were monoclonal. Do you know anything about the specificity of the TCR? Sorry, I just had to ask.
No, of course. I would love to be able to answer the question. I hope we will be able to. That will come.
For the studies you've done on the mutation screening for Evans syndrome, but also SRC, I'm just really wondered what your thought for the patient you have not found a mutation. Is that because of misdiagnosis or because of technology limitations or both or anything else?
I think everything is possible from these are really patients without any germline important predisposition to develop autoimmunity, not talking about GWAS studies or things like that. But perhaps we missed the mutations. Either because they were in a promoter somewhere, or why not, they may be in regulatory regions, or a few genes we have not captured, so everything is possible.
So, somewhat unusual question. In these severe cases of autoimmune disease, you also mentioned neurological consequences. What are those?
What are the
neurological consequences?
Neurological? Did I say that?
Yes, it was on the.
But yes, in the global list of autoimmune manifestations. Okay, no, not in the context of Evans syndrome. Sorry. So there are a few cases of polyradiculonephritis, multinephritis. I think also some disease of the white matter that is not that clear. It's not fully demonstrated that it can be considered as autoimmune, but likely autoimmune. But mostly peripheral polyradiculonephritis or multinephritis. Good question. I have to check, I have to say. It's probably not very frequent because it doesn't come to my mind, but I can't exclude that. Of course, one may expect there may be a few, but like that, I can't tell you with precision. I'm sorry. I may check and tell you later.
Regarding your cohort studies in the pediatric SLE and the Evans syndrome, do you think that the mutation you found are necessary and sufficient to cause disease? I mean, do they segregate, etc.?
That's, of course, difficult to answer today. the fact that there are recurrences of mutations found in the same gene in different families, as well as the function of this, what is known from the gene products, as well as the characteristics of these mutations in terms of likelihood of being pathogenic with all of the caveats we know, they all converge to think that they play an important role. There are a few cases where there are familial recurrences, but of course I can't exclude that there are other genetic variants that may associate and are causal, although I have to say, among these 56 patients, if I remember correctly, we didn't find any, but of course it doesn't tell that they don't exist.
So Alain, thank you for your talk. The pediatric SLE cohort, was that selected somehow or is it completely unbiased? So were there indeed pedigrees involved here, or was there autoimmunity within the families? Is it very, I mean, SLE is a wide range of different manifestations.
I agree. So they all met the criteria of SLE. I don't know exactly what it means, but it's a minimum. And they all of the patients had a pediatric onset. So that's what I can say.
Meaning before the age of 16?
No, actually, those, I think all of them had an onset below the age of 10.
Right.
And actually, there is no male to female difference, for instance, which is expected in such a case. But I agree with you that it's probably hugely heterogeneous. That's for sure.
Thank you. In regard to the pediatric autoimmune cohort again, so what is your clinical practice in choosing the unconventional new targeted therapy in these patients who have no known genetic disease, does not correlate with the genotype, but have a pathogenic or likely pathogenic variant?
But this is exactly where we are today. Since the data are quite recent, they are not yet published, actually. And so we are considering, of course, this has to be discussed carefully, case by case, with the clinicians. But for instance, I mentioned the potential usage of JAK inhibitors in the case of gain of function of JAK1. I think it's very tempting to do so. But by the way, I have to add, since they are obviously the most severe cases, where if we have a very strong evidence of a genetic lesion that may be at least partially causal, that may make to think about transplantation of these patients. It's a difficult, I think perhaps paradoxically, it would be more difficult to take these medical decisions with a broader offer, I would say.
Could I ask a question which is about the relationship between pediatric onset autoimmune disease and what's going on in adults? Because it would be satisfying to pull these together.
I'm aware of one study, a similar study performed in adults with Evans syndrome, and they found, I'm sorry, I don't remember who did the study, but they found that I think it was a cohort of 70 patients or so, they found mutations potentially or likely pathogenic, so same kind of definition, in 8%. So 8 versus 65. So of course it would be interesting then to look at intermediate populations, teenagers and so on, and to look how it goes down from early age to more older people. But it's not very surprising, I would say, to me at least.